So let's spend a couple minutes just talking about what to expect from these sessions going forward, just to make sure everyone has the same expectations for this. So these will be 60-minute weekly sessions, as you probably saw. There's a few different group sessions that will be there every week. You can see the schedule in the group, in the class Slack channel. You can move between sessions every week if you want. I think generally people pick someone that they pick a session that they like because of the schedule or because you enjoy whatever, however that mentor is doing things and stick with it. But obviously you have freedom to switch as much as you want. The ask is just to attend at least one of them every single week. So these sessions will be recorded, as you can probably tell, and will be available afterwards. My goal is to have this up hopefully later tonight, what we're talking about in today's session. And I will also note, I will like cut out like the first parts of these sessions when we're going through like the icebreaker and stuff. So, your answers will not be recorded in perpetuity. So don't worry about that. But we'll start with the main content as what will be recorded and shared and accessible for you to reference later on whenever you want. Typically, the way I'm thinking about running these sessions is we'll do like a quick, much shorter check-in in future weeks. We'll start off with kind of one of these kind of more fun, lighthearted questions. Spend like 10 to 15 minutes doing a group discussion on the topics for that week. My goal is to have these discussions be additive to whatever the materials are. So whether it's focusing on a topic that's like particularly difficult or nuanced, or maybe talking about a tangential topic that's sort of related but not directly covered. But I want to spend most of the time doing just like live coding. And I think my thinking right now is to do like we'll build out essentially a whole different project throughout these group sessions that will build on top of each other. Maybe something like I've been thinking maybe like a React blog, maybe as a way to like see all these concepts in action in the different sort of application contexts. So you can see that. Um, yes, Anthony. The attendance form is. I will send you the link. Yep. Oh, thank you. Yep. So you just go to that link. It's like a 10-second form. Okay, so those will be that's my plan structure for these sessions. I think the main thing I want to say is like I highly encourage lots of questions. The goal of these sessions is to get your questions answered and to make sure that you are understanding what we're actually doing in this class. So whether that's you can ask live during these sessions, of course, you can interrupt me, make use of the Zoom chat, use the forum, the check-in forum, ping me on Slack. If there's a specific topic you want us to cover in a session, like feel free to ping me ahead of time and I'll make sure we get that included. So like please ask all and any questions you have. Most likely if you have a question, there's other people on this call who also have the questions. So it'll be beneficial for everyone. And the final thing I just want to say is, as I mentioned earlier, this is my first time being a group mentor. So please share feedback on how we can make these things better and more useful for you all. So again, either you can tell me live, you can ping me on Slack separately. There's also like an anonymous feedback form, which I'll put up at the end, just to get your thoughts on how this session went. So again, lots of channels hopefully to provide thoughts on how we can make these better. And I welcome all and any feedback that you all have. All right, I'll pause there. Any questions about any of that or any other logistical questions related to the class?
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to find out what's the reason of using JavaScript instead of TypeScript for this React class? Is it possible that you could do both?
Yes. So the reason the class is done in JavaScript is, I think, to be frank, because it's a simpler way to start. So all the course materials and the assignments are done in JavaScript on purpose. So I would encourage you that for this class, I would stick to JavaScript. However, later on in the class, I think we'll start to touch on TypeScript a little bit. And I will also likely will, in one of these future sessions, can speak more to TypeScript as well. Because yes, I think in reality, TypeScript is much, much better in many ways. And for folks who I have no idea what we're talking about. Uh, TypeScript is a variant of JavaScript, the programming language, with some additional features which make it a little bit, in my opinion, better to use. So yeah, my answer to that would be for this class, I would stick with JavaScript, but we'll talk about TypeScript later on.
Thanks.
Mhm. Other questions? Go for it, Jason.
Um, in your opinion, how in, important is it to learn React in today's world?
Yeah, I think React is a very good thing to know. And I'll talk about this in the next section a little bit about React. But yeah, my main answer would be it's a great thing to be learning right now. It's one of the most commonly used frameworks out there for lots of different things. So yeah, it's a good thing that you're here in this class learning this.
Okay, thank you.
I was gonna say, I think I remember seeing some pretty big names. I forgot where, but I think PayPal uses React.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think now it's like it's become the industry standard. So I think almost everyone is using React in some form at this point. I mean, just for a little bit of background, right? React was actually created by Facebook, what was then now Meta, uh, to build the Facebook website. So, and it's to this day still that's what it's used for, and all of Meta's other products. So, and yeah, almost everyone uses React, I think, in some way. So it's a very good thing to learn.
Nice.
All right. Any other logistical questions regarding the class or these sessions before we talk a little bit more about React? Okay. Um, any questions pop up, obviously feel free to stop me. But let's chug along. Okay. So it's week one. Y'all are obviously just getting started thinking about React, setting it up. I want to take a moment to maybe talk a little bit about how you should think about React and the discussion we were just having, like why it's actually a good thing to be learning React right now. So just for some nomenclature, right? So React is what's considered to be a library or specifically a framework built on top of JavaScript. So just to be super clear, right? JavaScript is the programming language that you all hopefully should have some familiarity with in terms of the core programming language that's used to do things in web browsers. React comes along as a framework, which is built on top of JavaScript, which essentially takes the basic JavaScript stuff and extends the capabilities, right? Adds new features, makes certain things easier to do, and hence that's why it's a framework. So you're still writing JavaScript, but you're just applying the React framework sort of on top of it. Now, as we were just saying, it's used by everyone at this point. I took some screenshots on the right. For example, ChatGPT, everyone's favorite, maybe your favorite chatbot. That's all built using React, for example. There's countless of other websites, all the Facebook products. Yeah, almost every single thing you're using probably on the web today is using React in some form. And I would say the big thing to think about, like why React has become so powerful, and I think you'll see this come about as we go through the class, is this idea of creating reusable components. So you can create this visual component once, and you can reuse it in a bunch of places without having to repeat yourself in terms of logic and styling and things like that. That's really the core power of React in many ways. So just something to keep in mind as we go forward in the class. And then the other thing, which is kind of cool and interesting that you may not realize is, although React is most known for being used to build websites, you can actually use React to build a lot of other stuff as well beyond websites. So the way it actually works is React is a framework, and you have the React code. In order to actually get it into the web browser, there's actually another package which is used for the web, it's called React DOM, which is actually used to translate React stuff into things that the web browser can actually output. So it turns out that actually that React DOM, you can swap it out for other sort of translation layers. So for example, there's a framework called React Native, which if you put that in instead, you can spit out mobile apps instead using the fundamentals of React. Or even for those of you who maybe play video games, if you know about the Xbox game console, the whole UI of the Xbox dashboard is all built using React as well. So if you really take the time to understand the fundamentals of React in this class, you will be able to leverage some of that to maybe go build things beyond websites, which I think is really cool and it's probably not talked about enough. So even more motivation, hopefully, for you all to spend the time really understanding what's going on. Yes, Jason.
I'm sorry, you might have mentioned it, but is React only like used in the browsers, or because
So
it says React Mobile? Is that an application you download off the store?
yeah, so I realize there's a typo there. Should be React Native, not React Mobile. But so I think it goes back to this idea of React itself is actually sort of like agnostic of whether like you want to render it in the browser. So React itself, what is React, right? It's used to essentially like describe and build user interfaces. But actually React itself is not necessarily tied to like, I want to build a user interface for a website. That's where there's this other, for websites, there's this other translation library called like React DOM in this case. And you actually see this like when we spin up a new React app for the web, you actually see like React DOM as a dependency. It's like the translation layer between React and like a web browser interface. So that's actually what allows you to spit it out and be shown in the web browser as a website. But you can swap that translation layer, just the translation layer, for other types of libraries. For example, React Native, I'll change the name here, which, for example, spits it out as a mobile app, right? So React itself is actually sort of agnostic of all of these platforms, which is what makes it really powerful as a way of like thinking. Yeah, great question. Any other questions on just React, why we're here, why we're doing this, why you should care? Okay, seeing no questions at this point. Um, the one other thing I want to just talk about just for a second, because it's something that's been asked more and more recently, is what about these AI tools? Should I be using them? Should I not be using them? Are they any good? Et cetera, et cetera. So here's my personal perspective that I would share with you all for this class. I think it's fine to use these AI tools, but I would use them with caution and with intention. So specifically, I think these like large language models, these chatbots, they've gotten really good at coding, and they actually happen to be pretty good at React because there's a lot of React content out there on the web, so it's become very good at it. But I can still make mistakes. I will say that. I personally see many instances of that, even with React stuff. So for this class, I would treat it like a search engine. So I would treat it like a more advanced Google search. So for example, you might say, hey, I don't really understand use state, for example, or like React hooks, just as a topic that we're going to cover later on in the class. You can ask ChatGPT or Claude or whoever, say, hey, can you explain this topic to me? Right? And it will spit something out. I think that's a fine way to use these tools in this class. What I would discourage you from doing is having these chatbots write your code for your assignments. Because at that point, you're not really learning anything, right? All you're learning is how to ask the chatbot to do the work for you. And I think it's really important to first make sure you build your intuition and understanding for what's actually going on. And then maybe at some point after a class, once you feel really good about those foundations, then you can start using these tools for actually code generation in the future, maybe for future projects that you want to work on. But I think for this class, I would really try to make sure like the code you write is written by you and not by these chatbots. I've definitely seen instances where students will maybe overuse these tools and then halfway through the class they're like, I don't understand what's going on anymore because they just got the chatbots to write all the code for them. And that's not a good place to be in. So that would be my one caution is they're a resource. I would treat them like a search engine kind of effectively for this class if you want to use them. I think it's not a bad idea to like if you haven't used these things before, like it's probably not a bad idea to play around with them a little bit on their free tiers. But yeah, don't over rely on them for actually generating code. Questions on that before we jump into some more fun live coding topics. Okay. The only other thing I would say, oh, let's see, question. Oh, no questions. Okay, great. The only other thing I would say is, I guess you can take my opinion for what it is, but generally speaking, Claude is considered to be sort of the best chatbot for code-related things. ChatGPT is also very good, I would say, but Claude is the favorite in the developer community right now. If you want to just play around with these and try these out. And as I said, these are actually both pretty good at React, which is helpful for this class.
Would you say Claude is better than ChatGPT and why?
So I think Claude is better. I think when it comes to coding tasks, I think Claude is better than ChatGPT. Um,
Okay.
well, I think they're both pretty good, right? Especially when it comes to React stuff, they're actually both pretty good. But Claude generally performs much better on benchmarks. I think even just in like if you just use them for enough time, I think you will figure out like there'll be certain things that Claude can do and then ChatGPT just like won't do for you. In terms of why, that's the billion dollar question, right? Um,
Right.
there's a lot of secret sauce that goes into building these things, and that's a for a very different class probably to talk about. Um, but the general developer kind of community thinks Claude is like the best at coding stuff, and then ChatGPT is probably a second.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, good things to play around and be aware of because these are only going to become more and more prevalent, whether it's in software engineering or just in life, to be honest. So good thing to get a head start. GitHub Copilot. So so it's funny, GitHub Copilot nowadays actually just runs on these same models. So I guess it's effectively, just a different interface into these same models nowadays because I think their original model was not very good. So they just gave up and started using these models behind the scenes. But I would say in terms of GitHub Copilot as a like interface into like Visual Studio Code, I would also steer away from using it too much for this class because again, you're kind of having the AI like make the code for you, which I don't think is useful in this sort of learning environment. So I would still encourage you to kind of handwrite your code here initially throughout this class. And then I think after you build up those foundations, I think then after this class, you can start thinking about using those tools more and more. All right. Yeah, of course. If there's no other questions, I think we should just get into some coding because that's more fun than reading slides. Yeah, Jason.
Oh, I so you showed an example of Facebook utilizing React. Is that happening at a, I'm sorry, I'm still kind of confused. Is that happening at the browser level, or for example, if it's on an application, is it also happening the retrieval of the code and setting the layout of the template? Is that also happening in the application?
Yeah, so React is being used for both. Like if you go to Facebook.com, that is a very big React application. It's probably the most, most used React application probably on the planet, right? Instagram on the web, same thing. And then also, if you use their mobile apps, that is also using React slightly differently. So it uses that React Native package that we were talking about to actually have it be usable, like for building a mobile app. But it's still using fundamentally under the hood the React concepts and
Is the
ideas.
React Native for the application, mobile applications?
Yeah, exactly. React Native is for using your React skills to build mobile applications.
Okay. Okay, that's
Yep.
what I was. Thank you very much.
Yep, of course. Yeah, that's a whole other beast, I will say. I've had some experience working with React Native, and it has its good things and it has some of its not so good things, I would say. All right. If there's no other questions, let's jump into some code. So let me share my screen here shortly. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm sharing my whole screen. Of course, nothing will go wrong. All right. So I think today, let's just walk through together, setting up a new React project, making sure we can run it, and let's also just push it up to GitHub and have it stored in the repo because I think I know some of you, maybe it's been a while since you've kind of gone through that whole process, so I think it's good to probably go through it one more time. So, and hopefully everything that we're going to do here should very closely follow the instructions for this week. So if you've read it, hopefully it seems familiar. And if you haven't read it, hopefully this is a good first time to see it and you'll recognize some of the stuff when you read the materials. So the first thing we have to do is we have to create a new application. And so I have a terminal open here on my computer, and I'm going to run the following command to start a new React application. So I'm just in a empty folder right now. So I'm going to run npm create v at latest, and we can maybe talk about each of these things one at a time so you understand what we're actually running. So npm stands for Node Package Manager, and it is related to the Node JavaScript runtime. So I know some of you have taken the Node class, so you probably know all this. But what a Node is a JavaScript runtime. So it's a way to essentially run JavaScript code outside of a web browser because JavaScript by itself typically can only run inside a web browser. So for example, it can't by itself like read a local file that you have on your file system, for example. So that's why you have these runtimes, which are ways like containers to run JavaScript code outside the context of a web browser so they can do more things. So Node.js is by far the most popular and commonly used JavaScript runtime. There's some other ones like that you might hear about, like Bun and Dino, but Node is by far the most popular. So that's what everyone uses. And so the Node Package Manager is sort of related to setting up and makes it easier to manage working with the Node runtime. So that's what npm is. You've seen that quite a bit. Create Vite at latest. So we're going to use this Vite command. Vite is sort of a scaffolding framework to build things like React apps. Comes with some other tools behind the scenes to make things run smoothly. So it's just an easy way to get started. You can think of it with a React app. And I'm just saying at latest to say, hey, let's use the latest version of this Vite command. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter. And it's going to ask me, in this case, actually, like, do you want to install it? If it's the first time you've run it, you can say yes. Okay, so then it's going to ask me a few things. So first it's going to say, what do you want the name of the project to be? So I'm just going to call this, again, let's set this up to be like our blog application that we'll work on throughout the class. So we'll call it, let's say like CTD J React blog. Seems like a reasonable name. Select the framework. We are in a React class, so we're going to use React. These are all other JavaScript front-end frameworks that exist. So you might see these names elsewhere pop up from time to time, but we want to use React. We're going to select that. Select variant. So for this class, we're just going to use plain JavaScript and not just JavaScript plus SWC, just JavaScript. We can talk about what these other things mean separately if you all are interested. And that's it. It has created the application. So it tells us actually we need to cd into this new folder that was created with the project name that we have. We have to run npm install and npm run dev. Okay, so we'll take those one at a time. So let's go into that directory. And I'm actually just going to open this in Visual Studio Code. Right, commands are a little bit different. Okay, so we are here in VS Code and we have the project. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is it told us actually we have to run another command, npm install. I'm just going to run it, and as it runs, I'll tell you what it is. So npm, Node Package Manager, right? So another really cool part of the Node runtime is it has all these extra features, right, to use JavaScript, but it also allows other developers to create libraries with new functionality, and then you can essentially call those libraries in to extend the functionality of the Node environment. So in this case, I'm saying, let's just install all the default dependencies that are specified for this project. That's what npm install does. And it actually creates this node underscore modules folder. And if I open this, see a bunch of stuff in here. These are all the different libraries that npm installed for us, including, if we scroll down far enough, the React library. And this is a behemoth, probably has stuff in here that you never should look at probably, but that's where all this extra functionality lives. And then to run the application, we need to run npm run dev. So I'm just going to do that. Actually, I'm going to open the terminal here. npm run dev. This actually is what will spin up server for us to actually see the application. So it tells us here, localhost 5173. I'm going to open up a browser, localhost 5173. Here's our application.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you show us how you found npm run dev?
Yes.
How you drew it was that?
Yes. So the simple answer is after I created the application, it told us we need to run cd npm install npm run dev. So that's the first way you would know right here. But
Right.
there's another way, which we'll get to in a second as well, in terms of what this actually is. But first, any other questions on anything we just did? Any of the commands, the topics I just talked about? Any questions?
Hi. I'm pretty sure we'll get to it, but I think it comes to mind right now, so I might as well just ask you. Um, what's the difference between the npm run dev and then npm build?
Yes. Okay, that's a great question. And now this has been a couple questions about this. Let's just talk about this. So one of the key files in the project is called this package.json file. So think of this as like a configuration file for how Node and npm should treat this whole project. So you can see here, for example, and this is automatically generated for us, right? So you can see like the name of the project, which is the name that we specified. Okay, this is a private project. You can give a version number. So there's a bunch of stuff in here, right? Now, one of these parts is this scripts configuration, right? So these are essentially shorthand for different scripts that we might want to run, right? So for example, there's this dev, build, lint, preview. There's these different scripts which are already created for us. And so let's go through each of these. So dev is, I want to, in a developer environment, I want to spin up the project, right? So that's what this dev is. And that's why you ran npm run dev, which would run that script. Now, let's say I wanted to do build, I would run npm run build, which would run this build script, which is specified as beat build under the hood. So build is for when you want to deploy this application somewhere, you need to build it first, right? Because by default, like if I just wrote JavaScript, if I wrote React code and just gave it to a browser, the browser has no idea what this React code is, right? Knows nothing about React. So in order to make it run, we have to first convert the React code into just regular old JavaScript code, and then give that JavaScript code to the browser so it can actually run it, right? So what this build command does essentially does that translation of let's just convert this into regular old JavaScript, something that we could just give a browser to run. So typically you would run build when you want to deploy something to a production environment. So like for this class, you won't really need to do it. 99% of the time, you're just going to run npm run dev and be good.
Right, right. So in other words, dev allows us to build a project, and then build allows us to package the project and deploy it.
Yep, exactly. It's a great way to say
All
it.
right, great.
Cool. And then maybe also, since we're already here, let's talk about the other things that are in this file. So dependencies. So these are the core external libraries that this project depends on, right? So you can see there's React, which makes sense. And then there's this React DOM, which if you remember from our discussion earlier, this is what is that translation layer to make the React code run in the browser. So that's what the two primary dependencies are. And then there's this dev dependencies. So these are dependencies which you only need in a developer environment when you're developing things. So there's a bunch of different things here. But typically when you then ship this code into production, the idea is you actually don't need these dependencies to run the code in production, so you can just ignore them, which means you don't have to download as much stuff. It's smaller package size, so there's benefits to that. And so you're only going to ship with these core dependencies that are required for the functionality of the app. And this is really good. And the reason why this is really helpful is because let's say you have a teammate who wants to run your project. They can just get your code. They don't have to think about, oh, I got to install React and React DOM and all this other stuff. They have to just run npm install. And that command will look at this file and install all the correct dependencies and stuff without the other person having to think about it. So that's why this is very powerful to have this configuration set up in one place. Yes, Jason.
How would that process go about to just npm install? Would you have to send the files over to their computer?
Yep. So this is where I think GitHub starts to become very useful for those sorts
Oh,
of things. But yes, the idea would be the idea, right, is you can send this folder, right? If we're just ignoring GitHub for a second, right? You can send this folder over to someone, zip it over, send it over to them. They can open the folder and they can just run npm install, and it will just make sure that their computer installs all the dependencies they need for this project without having to worry about, oh, do I have this installed? Do I have this installed? Like, no, this will take care of it for them. But I think ideally in kind of a normal setting, that's where tools like GitHub come into play to help with that. Awesome. Any other questions on anything we talked about so far? Otherwise, I'm just going to quickly run through the rest of these files that are here in this application, and then we'll get on to putting this up on GitHub. Okay, so let's go through the rest of these files. So we talked about, is there a question? Uh, yes, question. Does the meeting end at 5? Uh, yes. So technically this will be 60 minutes. So until 6 o'clock Eastern. Folks should feel free to drop at that point. But I'm also will stay on if folks have other questions that they want to ask after that. Cool. Okay, let's run through some of these other files that are here. Um, okay, so we talk about node modules. These are sort of those, again, external packages that are sort of downloaded for us. Public folder, this is where you would store things like images, icons, just assets of those sorts. you'd store them in this public folder. Source, SRC, this is where the core the application is, all the logic is. So you can see there's CSS files in here, is JSX, which is a JavaScript file with React support. CSS, this is where the core code is. Git ignore, for those of you who hopefully have worked with Git before, you should know what this is. This is specifying to the Git version control that these are the files that you should ignore when you're doing version control, such as ignore node module, because we don't want to send up all these excess packages to GitHub. That will be a waste of space. ESLint, this is for the linter, which can specify essentially it's like a rule book for, hey, am I doing this code correctly, or is this formatted correctly? So this is a bunch of rules essentially that specify some of those things. You don't have to worry about this really at any point. Index.html, this is actually like the core HTML file that is actually shipped to the browser. And you can see all it is it's just a single script tag, which is main.jsx. So this is where all the React stuff is actually loaded in. So that's how it actually works under the hood. Package.lock, it's a bit of a mess of a file. Hopefully, again, never have to touch it. The idea there is because multiple people might be working on a project at a given time, it's a way to make sure that the versions of each of these packages is consistent for everyone. That's what that lock file does, is it freezes the versions to prevent sort of unintended differences in implementation or things like that that might pop up. README, this is the main just README for the repository that you'll see also show up in GitHub. And then there's this final config file for Vite. Again, you don't really have to worry about this. It's just a config file for the Vite tooling and runtime. Okay, any questions about this? I guess the only other thing I would say is the main file that you will start working in for your assignment this week is this app.jsx file. This is a bunch of boilerplate code that you will get rid of for the first assignment, but this is where you will start working in. This is app.jsx file.
Is that code right there when you showed the Vite page earlier? Is that what's making all that happen?
Yep, exactly. So this is the code. So you can see, for example, we say like Vite plus React. So I can say like, hello React. If I hit save, now it says hello React. And that's another really cool thing is I just changed the code. I hit save and it just automatically updated my browser. I didn't have to restart anything. It's a nice quality of life thing.
Nice.
All right. Any other questions on this before we put this up onto GitHub in the last few minutes? Yeah, Jason.
Is the file structure in this very strict?
Sometimes, yeah. For some things, yes. For other things, no. So I would say, like, as a general rule of thumb, once you're inside this source folder, the structure can be you can customize the structure however you want. I would keep main.jsx just like directly underneath the source folder. Some of this app.css, like I would leave those, but then everything else is you can start making folders for organization and stuff. For all the files outside the source folder, I would just leave them as is because they are there for a reason and other things will need to depend on them being in that location. So I would leave everything else alone, but inside the source folder, you have some flexibility.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you wouldn't touch?
Essentially everything outside the like the source folder. So everything else here.
Yeah, in
I
the
would
source
just
folder, you mentioned not to touch.
I would leave main.jsx alone because this is you can see like this is kind of the where you're actually loading in the root element in the HTML, like where you're loading all the React stuff. I would just leave this alone. You should almost never have to touch this file anyway. I would just leave that as it is.
Okay.
Everything else you can kind of move around if you want.
Nice. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Any other questions here before we go on to GitHub? In the meantime, I'm just going to open up GitHub here.
Yeah, before we go on GitHub, when I was reading the material, I did see something with regards to server-side rendering and then client-side rendering. Uh, could you share a bit of light on it?
Yes, that is a very meaty topic. Um, so I will give you like a 30-second summary of that. I would say generally that's like not super important for you all to understand right now. But at a super high level, there's like two ways that this whole application can work, right? So the application effectively is a big JavaScript file, right? That runs. So one option is you just take that big JavaScript file and you send it to the browser and just have the browser then like run the code, right? That's like one option. Um, yeah, if folks need to start dropping, feel free to do that. I know we're at time. But if you want to stick around for GitHub, please feel free to do so. Um, so that's the client side rendering is like we take this big JavaScript file, we ship it to the browser, and then like the whole thing, and then the browser is actually responsible for running the JavaScript and all this stuff. Server side rendering is we don't do that. Instead, on some server somewhere where this is running, we run the JavaScript there on the server, generate the HTML, CSS code, and then only ship that HTML and CSS code to the browser. So that's server-side rendering. So that's the main difference. There's pros and cons to both of them. Very people use both. There's times when you use one or the other. But as I said, for this class, we don't really talk about it, I don't think that much, but at a high level, that's what it is.
Thanks.
Yep. All right, let's get this up on GitHub. I think that's important. Okay, so I'm going to open up GitHub, my web browser, and I'm going to create a new repository. Is there? Yes. Thanks, Maria. Okay. So I'm gonna make a new browser, new repository, and I'll just call it, just for consistency, I'll call it the same thing: CTD J React blog. I'll make it public so you all can have access to this as well in the future weeks. Uh, Leave all this other stuff alone. Create a repository. So this will create a blank repository on your GitHub profile. And luckily, it has some instructions for us that we can use to actually push our code up. So specifically, we want to use this push existing repository from the command line. Before we get there, let me go back into my project and let me just open up the full terminal so you all can see better. So to make sure that there's actually a Git repo here, let's run git status. Okay, so it's interesting, right? By default, Vite does not set this up as a Git repository. So before you actually do anything, I would set this up. So I'm going to run git init to initialize the Git version control on this folder. Git status now, everything is untracked, which makes sense. We're going to add all this so we can commit it. So git add dot to add everything. Run git status, everything is now green. Git commit, I'll call it just init project. Okay, so now we actually have a repository locally. So now we can push this up to GitHub. So if I go back to now the empty repository, push existing repository from the command line, exactly what we want. So the easiest thing to do is you just like hit this copy button in the top right of this box, go to your command line, paste it, and run it. We can walk through each of these independently. You can see you might get this error, which is you don't have permission to push to this repository. And there's a few ways you can set it up. I use SSH keys for connecting to my GitHub, which I would encourage you all to do. There's also another way where you can like enter your username and password and your credentials. If you have the time, I would set up SSH. I can tell you how to do that. But now if we rerun the code, we'll talk about each of these lines in a second, but it finished it. If I refresh the repository, there's our code on GitHub in this repository. Lovely. So let's just go through each of those lines of code that we did. So, okay, the first one, git remote add origin, and then a bunch of this stuff. That line is essentially a way to say like, hey, there's a remote version of this repository somewhere. It's at this URL, so just set it for this repository. That's essentially what that line does. Git branch -m main. That's just a renaming of the current branch to make sure it's called main, which is sort of the default branch that people use. And then git push u origin main. So that is a good command to become familiar with, right? Or become re-familiar with. So git push just means I'm pushing my code to the remote repository. Yeah, thanks for being here. All right. And then origin main. So then I have to specify, I have this local repository. I'm on the main branch right now. I need to specify what remote repository I want to push to and what branch on that remote repository. So you would say git push origin, which refers to that remote repository that we just set up, and main, so push to the main branch in the remote repository. So that's what this does. This -u, what it does is it essentially makes the linkage between the local branch and the remote branch permanent. So you don't have to every time specify like a remote branch to push to for this local branch. So then in the future, I can just run git push and it will just know like, okay, I'm on the main branch right now locally. I know I have to push to this remote branch called main also. And I'll just do it automatically. I know what to do. That's what that -u does. Just set that up. Questions on any of that? I'm also just going to quickly walk through like how you will set up a new assignment and a new branch and a pull request and all that stuff, because that will also be important. But before that, any questions? Okay. So let's say, for example, I have this code. Lovely. I want to start working on my week 1 assignment. The way we do that is you want to make sure you do that work in a separate branch. So right now I'm on the main branch. If you ever don't know what branch you're on, just run git branch. It'll tell you main branch. And then you want to create a new branch locally for that assignment. So for example, I will say git checkout B to create a new branch and then name the new branch. You can just call it like week 1, week 2, whatever. For now, I'll just call it, feature 1, just as a placeholder. So this switches me into this new branch. Now, when you're in this new branch, you can make whatever changes you want. So I'm just going to go here and make a really simple change and make this React blog. So I'm just changing the README file, the title. Okay, now I made this change. You can see there's a change now. I'm going to commit this change. So git add, git commit, updated README. So now I need to push this remotely. So what I'll do is I'll run git push u just to set up this linkage in the future. I want to send it to the remote branch that we set up, right? Origin. But I want to push it to a branch, which is also called feature 1 on GitHub. Now there isn't one right now. So I can just say, I want to push it to a feature 1 branch on GitHub. And the cool thing is it will automatically create it on GitHub for us if it doesn't exist. Again, I could just run git push origin feature 1. That will do the same thing. But what the U does is essentially just makes that linkage again between the local feature 1 branch and the remote feature 1 branch. So we don't have to keep specifying it every time. So push it, pushes it up. Great. So now if I go back to the GitHub page, you'll see now there's a new branch. If I refresh the page, the new branch called feature 1. And this has the change we just made. So you want to do this for each of your assignments. Now, the last step you want to do before submitting is creating a pull request. So you would go to pull requests, you would say create a new pull request. Then you would specify, okay, I want the base branch to be the main branch. And then for compare, this is the branch that you are working on for your assignment. So in this case, I would select feature 1. It shows you actually what the changes that happened since between the branches. So you can see the change we made in the README file. You say create pull request, for the title, for the description, hit create pull request. And then you would copy the link to this pull request, and that's what you submit in your assignment. And then in here, your assignment reviewer will go through, leave comments. And then once the comments are done and your reviewer says, yep, this is good, that's when you hit this nice green button, merge pull request, which will merge the changes into your main branch. and then you can start over for the next assignment. Okay, questions on any of that? And hopefully you will become more and more comfortable as you actually do this for the first couple of times. Yep, Jason.
Yeah, sorry, I lost track at the last part where you do the pull request. Can you show that again?
Yep. So what I did here is I just went to the pull request tab. In the repository, I just hit this new pull request button and I just specify what branch am I trying to pull into the main branch. So this base branch will be always main, so that's like the branch you're trying to update, and then compares like the branch that you are just working on right now. So in this case, it would be like feature one, for example, or whatever your branch is that you're working on. And then you'll know it'll give you a brief description of like what has changed between the branches. And you just create, in this case, I already created one, but it would say create pull request in this green button. And that's what would create the pull request, which would be this page. And then you would just take the link to this pull request, and that's what you submit in your assignment.
Thank you.
Yep. And the one thing I would just say is do not click this green merge pull request button until you've gotten approval from your reviewer.
Sounds good. And regarding the hyphen U, you said that's just to link it, so you won't ever have to do it again.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I
So
I
it's this idea that we have like a local repository, right? With some branches. And then we have this remote repository on GitHub with some branches. So we need to specify like, hey, this branch that we're working on locally should correspond to this branch that exists on GitHub because they might be like named different things or whatever, right? Theoretically. So we just need to specify that linkage. So
Nice.
what that dash U essentially just does is it just says, going forward for this local branch, push it to this remote branch every time. So then every time in the future, I can just say git push. I don't have to specify like where you will need to push it to. It will know it. It will save it. That's what the dash U does. It's essentially just saving that configuration.
Nice. But you would need to create a second branch for the next week's assignment, right?
Yes. So every week you should create a new branch for that assignment. So the way it would work, right, is you create a branch for week one, you do all your code, you get an approval from your reviewer, you hit the merge pull request button, which will merge all the changes into the main branch. And then you would create a new branch off of that new main branch called week two. And then you go from there.
Thank you.